They thought they could abuse the horse with impunity, but they didn't know who it belonged to. When the owner showed up, everything changed. Watch to the end. Write in the comments what city you're from. The midday sun loomed high in the sky, casting an oppressive heat over the endless stretch of desert road. Waves of shimmering air rose from the cracked asphalt, distorting the horizon in an illusion of liquid heat. A warm wind carried the scent of dust and sagebrush, whispering across the landscape where nature remained untouched by time. There was no sound but the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above and the rhythmic clop of hooves against the ground. A lone figure rode through this vast emptiness, his silhouette stark against the golden haze of the desert. Seated atop a muscular chestnut stallion, the man moved with the relaxed ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. His name was Chuck Norris. Beneath the brim of his worn cowboy hat, his sharp eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the land as if committing it to memory. The road stretched before him in an unbroken line, leading toward a small town nestled at the base of the distant hills. His horse, Grom, was steady and sure-footed, carrying him without hesitation. A battle-hardened companion, Grom had been with him for years, surviving countless miles of rough terrain and unpredictable encounters. The horse's coat gleamed under the harsh sun, its muscles rippling with each movement. They had seen too much together to be fazed by the desolation of the open road. As they approached the town, the first signs of civilization appeared, an old, rusted sign welcoming travelers to a place few had reason to visit. The town itself was modest, a collection of buildings clustered along the main street. A gas station stood at the entrance, its peeling paint and sun-worn sign evidence of years spent under an unforgiving sky. Further down, a small general store and a couple of weathered shops hinted at a once thriving community now reduced to a whisper of its former self. The heart of the town was a roadside cafe, the kind of place where time moved slow and the coffee was always hot, if not always fresh. Chuck guided Grom toward a wooden hitching post outside the cafe, dismounting with practiced ease. He loosened the reins just enough to allow the horse to lower its head and graze on the dry tufts of grass poking through the cracked pavement. Grom huffed softly, shaking his mane as if acknowledging the brief respite. Chuck adjusted his hat, dusted off his jeans, and stepped toward the cafe's entrance. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior where the air was thick with the scent of brewed coffee, grilled food, and a hint of cigarette smoke lingering from an earlier patron. The place was nearly empty, save for a few locals scattered across the booths and counter stools. An old trucker in a faded plaid shirt sat nursing a cup of coffee, his calloused hands wrapped around the ceramic mug as if drawing warmth from it. A man in a baseball cap and work boots sat near the window, flipping through a dog-eared newspaper. Behind the counter, a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes wiped down the surface with slow, practiced movements. She glanced up as Chuck entered, offering a polite nod before returning to her task. He walked to a table near the window, taking a seat where he could keep an eye on both the street and Grom outside. The waitress approached, her notepad poised in her hand. "Coffee," Chuck said simply. She nodded and walked away without another word. Moments later, she returned with a steaming cup, setting it down in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, letting the warmth seep into his skin. The first sip was strong and bitter, just the way he liked it. Outside, Grom remained calm, his ears flicking occasionally at the sounds of the town. The stallion was accustomed to strange places and unfamiliar surroundings. He had learned long ago that as long as Chuck was near, there was no reason to fear anything. Chuck took another sip of coffee, leaning back in his chair. It was rare to find moments of peace like this. The open road, a quiet town, a good horse, and a decent cup of coffee. There was something satisfying about the simplicity of it all. He had spent years traveling, never staying in one place for too long. Some might call it a restless existence, but for him, it was just the way things were. The moment stretched on, unhurried and undisturbed. Then, from the distance, the low growl of engines shattered the quiet. It was subtle at first, just a murmur on the wind. But it grew louder, the unmistakable rumble of approaching motorcycles echoing through the streets like distant thunder. The sound carried a weight to it, a presence that didn't belong in a place like this. Chuck didn't turn his head, didn't move, but his grip on the coffee cup tightened slightly. His eyes remained on the window, watching as a pack of riders appeared on the edge of town. The group moved as one, a formation of iron and leather, their bikes glinting in the afternoon sun. There were at least a dozen of them, roaring down the street like they owned it. The atmosphere inside the cafe shifted. The trucker lowered his cup, his eyes flickering toward the window with quiet apprehension. The man with the newspaper stopped turning pages. The waitress hesitated, her cloth frozen mid-wipe. Everyone knew what a group like this meant. Trouble. Chuck exhaled slowly, setting his cup down with deliberate care. He had seen men like these before, knew their kind all too well. They were the type who thrived on intimidation, who saw small towns as playgrounds for their reckless amusement. They would make their entrance loud, make their presence known, and if no one stopped them, they would do as they pleased. The motorcycles roared past the cafe, their engines growling as they slowed to a halt outside. The riders dismounted one by one, stretching their legs, cracking their knuckles. They scanned their surroundings, taking in the town, the people, the opportunities for mischief. And then one of them spotted Grom. A grin spread across the face of a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a jacket adorned with patches of skulls and flames. His companions followed his gaze, their amusement growing. A few exchanged glances, chuckling under their breath. One of them nudged another, pointing toward the horse. Chuck remained still, watching. Outside, the leader of the pack took a slow step toward Grom, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a show. He muttered something to his crew, and they laughed. Then, without hesitation, he lifted his boot and drove it hard into the stallion's side. Grom let out a sharp snort, his muscles tensing beneath his coat. He jerked his head, trying to move away, but the tether held firm. The laughter of the bikers carried into the cafe, loud and mocking. Inside, Chuck Norris set his coffee cup down. His fingers slid off the handle with the precision of a man who had already made his decision. The tension in the room thickened as he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the wooden floor. He stood up, adjusting his hat, his movements measured, deliberate. Then, without a word, he walked toward the door. The heavy wooden door of the cafe creaked slightly as Chuck Norris stepped outside. The air was dry, thick with heat, and carried the faint scent of gasoline from the dozen motorcycles now parked haphazardly along the street. The gang of bikers stood around, laughing amongst themselves, their voices, loud and cocky, filling the space where silence had once reigned. Grom stood tethered where Chuck had left him, his muscles tense beneath his chestnut coat. His ears twitched back and forth, his dark eyes wary. The stallion was not easily rattled, but he had never known the cruelty of men who found joy in the suffering of others. One of the bikers, the tallest among them, stood closest to Grom, his boot still planted in the dirt where he had kicked the horse just moments before. His grin stretched wide across his bearded face, his posture loose and confident, as though he had just proven something of great amusement to his gang. Chuck stepped off the wooden porch, his boots striking the ground with quiet finality. He did not speak. He did not rush. He moved with a controlled ease, the kind of movement that belonged to men who never had to prove anything. The leader of the gang caught sight of him, tilting his head slightly before laughing under his breath. "Well, well," the man mused, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. "Looks like we've found ourselves a real cowboy." The others chuckled, some nudging each other, some crossing their arms over their broad chests. The town was silent, the people frozen where they stood. From the cafe's doorway, the trucker with the plaid shirt took a slow step back, pressing his shoulder against the frame. The waitress had stopped wiping down tables entirely, her eyes darting between Chuck and the gang. Chuck stopped a few feet away from them. His gaze moved over the group with an assessing calm, taking in every face, every stance, every breath. The leader smirked, turning slightly toward Grom before running a hand along the stallion's strong neck, mockingly affectionate. "This your horse, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer. The leader let out a low whistle, looking back at his men. "Hell of a thing, huh? Out here riding through the dust like it's the Wild West." He leaned in closer to Grom, his grin never fading. "Thing is, we don't take kindly to people bringing old relics into the future. Thought we'd teach this one a little lesson." One of the bikers, younger than the rest, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tapped against the handle of his belt knife. He wasn't smiling anymore. There was something about the way Chuck stood, something about the way he hadn't said a word that was beginning to eat at the gang's confidence. The leader didn't notice. He was enjoying himself too much. "Maybe we ought to see if he can run as fast as those wheels over there," the man continued, jerking his thumb toward the parked motorcycles. "What do you think, boys?" The gang muttered their agreement, a few laughing, a few shifting eagerly on their feet. Chuck lifted his chin slightly, his gaze settling on the leader with an expression unreadable. The man smirked wider, then, without warning, raised his boot and kicked Grom again, harder this time. The stallion let out a sharp, startled sound, jerking violently against his tether. His front hooves lifted off the ground for a moment before landing heavily, his breathing fast. Dust kicked up around him as he tried to step back, but the rope held him in place. Chuck's expression did not change. He did not flinch, did not tense. Instead, he exhaled slowly as if settling something deep within himself. Behind him, the townspeople held their breath. One of the bikers chuckled, but the sound faltered when he saw the look on Chuck's face. The leader took a step back from the horse, dusting off his jacket as if unimpressed. "I'd be real careful if I were you, cowboy," he said, still smirking. "Things can get ugly when a man doesn't know his place." Chuck tilted his head ever so slightly. The leader's smirk faltered just a fraction. His eyes flickered, barely perceptible, but the shift was there. He could feel it now, that weight in the air, that invisible force pressing down on him, telling him something he didn't quite understand, but should have. One of the gang members cleared his throat. Boss." The leader held up a hand, silencing him. He straightened his shoulders as if shaking off the creeping unease. Chuck took another step forward. The gang tensed. The air was thick, electric, humming with something unseen, but felt by everyone. And then Chuck spoke, his voice calm, measured, and absolute. "Step away from my horse." The words were soft, almost too soft, but they carried the weight of something solid, something immovable. The leader hesitated, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a man used to being told what to do, least of all by someone who looked like they had stepped out of an old Western movie. His pride demanded he push forward, but something deeper, something primal, warned him to stop. The gang shifted again, more of them looking uncertain now. But the leader wasn't done playing his game. He let out a slow exhale through his nose, his smirk returning with an edge of defiance. "And if I don't?" Chuck's eyes didn't waver. The leader's fingers twitched slightly at his side, as if considering his next move. Then, in the silence, Grom stomped a hoof against the dirt, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. The leader flinched, and Chuck took one last step forward. The gang's tension snapped like a pulled wire. One of them reached for something at his belt, another shifted toward his bike. The leader's breath hitched just slightly, just enough to show the crack in his bravado. He had expected a reaction, anger, maybe even a threat, but this was something else. Chuck lifted his hand, slow and deliberate. The leader's smirk disappeared entirely. For the first time since they had arrived, the bikers looked at each other, silently asking the same question. Had they just made a mistake? A heavy pause settled over the street, stretching longer than any of them liked. Then, without another word, Chuck reached down and loosened Grom's tether, untying the knot with an ease that made it look effortless. The stallion shifted, his ears flicking back before returning forward, sensing the shift in the moment. Chuck ran a hand along the horse's neck, steady, controlled. Then he turned, and without hesitation, he walked toward the leader of the gang. The town had grown deathly quiet. The laughter of the bikers had died down into a tense, waiting stillness. The air, thick with heat, seemed to hum with an unseen force, an invisible weight pressing against those who stood too close. The leader of the gang, his smirk fading into something more guarded, adjusted the sleeves of his jacket, his fingers clenching slightly before relaxing again. His men, who had moments ago been all swagger and bravado, now looked between each other, uncertain. Chuck Norris walked toward them with the same steady, deliberate stride he had always carried. He didn't rush, didn't falter. He moved like a man who had no need to prove himself. There was no show of force, no threats. He simply advanced, his eyes locked on the one who had dared to lay a foot against his horse. Grom stood behind him now, ears flicking, watching with quiet intelligence. The leader tilted his head, glancing sideways at his crew before exhaling sharply through his nose. "You've got some nerve," he muttered, though the edge of confidence in his voice had dulled. "Walking up to us like that. You sure you know what you're doing, cowboy?" Chuck said nothing. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady, unwavering. The leader swallowed, barely noticeable, before straightening his posture. His pride wouldn't let him back down. Not here, not in front of his men. He had seen men like this before, the quiet ones, the ones who didn't flinch, but there was something different about this one, something carved into the lines of his face, etched into the way he held himself. He wasn't just another cowboy passing through. Behind him, one of the younger bikers shifted uneasily, his fingers tapping against the buckle of his belt. Another, broader and heavily tattooed, rolled his shoulders as if preparing for something. They all felt it now, that weight in the air, that unseen shift. Chuck adjusted the brim of his hat slightly, then exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, level, but each word carried the weight of something immovable. "I told you to step away from my horse." The leader scoffed, but it was weaker now, forced. "And what if I don't?" Chuck's eyes didn't waver. He didn't blink. The silence stretched long and thin until it was nearly unbearable. One of the bikers let out a short, nervous laugh, but it faded, just as quickly as it had come. The leader shifted his weight, rolling his tongue over his teeth before finally breaking eye contact, looking down for just a fraction of a second. It was small, barely noticeable, but Chuck saw it. The leader exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "All right," he muttered, lifting his hands as if backing down. "Didn't know you were so attached to the damn thing." He took a slow step away from Grom, motioning for his men to do the same. "No harm done, huh?" Chuck's expression didn't change. His stance remained firm, as if reading something deeper in the man's words. The gang leader let out a short chuckle, looking to his men for some reassurance, but none of them were laughing now. They were watching Chuck, waiting, as if sensing that things weren't quite over yet. Then, in the thick silence, a chair scraped against the wooden floor inside the cafe. The sound was distant, small, but it shattered whatever thin thread had been holding the moment in place. The leader's fingers twitched just slightly, and in that split second Chuck saw everything. He moved before the man had even finished his breath. The gang leader barely had time to register what was happening before Chuck's hand shot out like a strike of lightning. His fingers closed around the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to send him stumbling forward off balance. The leader let out a sharp grunt, his boots skidding against the dirt, but before he could regain his footing, Chuck delivered a controlled strike to his chest, sending him staggering back into his own men. The gang erupted into motion. One of the bikers lunged forward, his fist swinging toward Chuck's face. Chuck pivoted, smooth and effortless, letting the punch sail past him before catching the man's arm and using his own momentum to send him sprawling into the dirt. Another came at him from the side, but Chuck ducked under the wild swing, his movements quick, efficient. He countered with a precise strike to the stomach, knocking the air out of the man's lungs. The leader, shaking off his daze, snarled as he charged. Chuck saw him coming from the corner of his eye. He sidestepped at the last moment, hooking his boot behind the man's ankle and sending him crashing to the ground with a hard thud. The town remained frozen, the locals watching in stunned silence. The trucker in the doorway of the cafe muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. The waitress clutched her towel against her chest, her knuckles white. One of the remaining bikers hesitated, looking down at his fallen comrades before glancing back at Chuck. There was fear in his eyes now, real fear, the kind that only came when a man realized he had picked the wrong fight. The leader groaned, pushing himself up onto his elbows, his face red with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What the hell are you?" he spat, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. Chuck exhaled, adjusting his hat once more. He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't even sweating. The gang leader's chest rose and fell rapidly as he looked around, seeing his men either on the ground or backing away. One of them was already moving toward the bikes, shaking his head, wanting no part of whatever this was anymore. Chuck stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. The leader flinched, just barely, but it was enough. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand despite the ache in his ribs. His pride wouldn't let him crumble completely, but he knew, everyone knew. The fight was already over. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't have to. He turned slightly, glancing at Grom, making sure the stallion was unharmed. The horse flicked his tail, standing firm, unbothered. The leader swallowed hard, his breathing still uneven. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't make another move. Instead, he looked to his men, then to the empty street, and slowly, grudgingly, he took a step back. "We're leaving," he muttered under his breath, though the words were more for himself than for anyone else. He turned, motioning for the others to follow. One by one, they stepped away, some limping, some cursing under their breath. A few climbed onto their bikes without another word, their engines rumbling low and uncertain. Chuck watched them, expression unreadable, as the gang slowly mounted their motorcycles. The leader hesitated one last time, glancing over his shoulder, but he didn't say anything. Then, with a final roar of engines, the bikers rode off, their tires kicking up a cloud of dust as they disappeared down the road. The town remained silent for a long moment. Then, finally, someone exhaled. The trucker let out a low whistle. The waitress muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Chuck turned back toward the cafe, stepping onto the wooden porch once more. He took his seat by the window, reached for his coffee, and took a slow sip. It was still warm. Outside, Grom stood tall, unshaken. The town, once again, was at peace. The dust from the departing motorcycles had barely settled when the leader of the gang stopped his bike at the edge of the street. His hands gripped the handlebars, knuckles white, his breath still ragged from the encounter. His pride had taken a hit, and though he had stepped back in front of his men, there was a fire in his gut that refused to be extinguished. He had been humiliated, brought to his knees in front of the very people he sought to dominate. The gang had started their engines, ready to ride off, but something held them back. A lingering tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The leader's jaw clenched, his mind warring between common sense and the deep, seething anger that told him he could not let this stand. He turned his head slightly, glancing at his men. Some of them were still rubbing sore jaws, others flexing their fingers, testing the bruises Chuck had left on them. Their expressions were a mix of frustration and hesitation. The leader exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to steady. He had seen something in that cowboy's eyes, something that unsettled him in a way no other fight ever had. But he wasn't a man who let things go, not when his authority had been challenged. His gaze flicked back toward the cafe. Chuck was still there, seated calmly by the window, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just taken down half the gang without so much as breaking a sweat. The leader's lips curled slightly. There was something unnatural about that kind of confidence, something that made his skin crawl, but that didn't matter now. He had made up his mind. Without a word, he killed the engine of his bike. The other gang members looked at him confused. One of them, a wiry man with a long scar running down his cheek, leaned closer. "We goin' or what?" he asked under his breath, wary. The leader didn't answer. Instead, he swung his leg over the motorcycle and stood. He rolled his shoulders, stretching out the stiffness in his muscles. Then, slowly, he began walking back toward the cafe. The gang hesitated only for a moment before following. Inside the cafe, Chuck had already noticed. He didn't need to turn his head to know that trouble had found its way back to him. He could hear the heavy bootfalls approaching, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as the locals tensed. He set his cup down on the saucer, exhaling slowly. The bell above the cafe door jingled sharply as it was pushed open. The leader stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a dark storm rolling over the desert. Behind him, his men filtered in, spreading out, forming an unspoken barrier between Chuck and the exit. The waitress instinctively took a step back behind the counter. The trucker in the plaid shirt barely moved, but his fingers twitched against his cup. Chuck didn't move. He simply lifted his gaze, meeting the leader's eyes with the same calm, measured look he had given before. The leader smirked, as if trying to regain some of his lost confidence. "You're real quiet, cowboy," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "I don't like that." Chuck didn't reply. The leader took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor. "See, I don't much care for guys who think they're better than me," he continued, "especially not ones who make me look bad in front of my boys." His pride wouldn't let him crumble completely, but he knew. Everyone knew. The fight was already over. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't have to. He turned slightly, glancing at Grom, making sure the stallion was unharmed. The horse flicked his tail, standing firm, unbothered. The leader swallowed hard, his breathing still uneven. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't make another move. Instead, he looked to his men, then to the empty street, and slowly, grudgingly, he took a step back. "We're leaving," he muttered under his breath, though the words were more for himself than for anyone else. He turned, motioning for the others to follow. One by one, they stepped away, some limping, some cursing under their breath. A few climbed onto their bikes without another word, their engines rumbling low and uncertain. Chuck watched them, expression unreadable, as the gang slowly mounted their motorcycles. The leader hesitated one last time, glancing over his shoulder, but he didn't say anything. Then, with a final roar of engines, the bikers rode off, their tires kicking up a cloud of dust as they disappeared down the road. The town remained silent for a long moment. Then, finally, someone exhaled. The trucker let out a low whistle. The waitress muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Chuck turned back toward the cafe, stepping onto the wooden porch once more. He took his seat by the window, reached for his coffee, and took a slow sip. It was still warm. Outside, Grom stood tall, unshaken. The town, once again, was at peace. The dust from the departing motorcycles had barely settled when the leader of the gang stopped his bike at the edge of the street. His hands gripped the handlebars, knuckles white, his breath still ragged from the encounter. His pride had taken a hit, and though he had stepped back in front of his men, there was a fire in his gut that refused to be extinguished. He had been humiliated, brought to his knees in front of the very people he sought to dominate. The gang had started their engines, ready to ride off, but something held them back. A lingering tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The leader's jaw clenched, his mind warring between common sense and the deep, seething anger that told him he could not let this stand. He turned his head slightly, glancing at his men. Some of them were still rubbing sore jaws, others flexing their fingers, testing the bruises Chuck had left on them. Their expressions were a mix of frustration and hesitation. The leader exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to steady. He had seen something in that cowboy's eyes, something that unsettled him in a way no other fight ever had. But he wasn't a man who let things go, not when his authority had been challenged. His gaze flicked back toward the cafe. Chuck was still there, seated calmly by the window, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just taken down half the gang without so much as breaking a sweat. The leader's lips curled slightly. There was something unnatural about that kind of confidence, something that made his skin crawl, but that didn't matter now. He had made up his mind. Without a word, he killed the engine of his bike. The other gang members looked at him confused. One of them, a wiry man with a long scar running down his cheek, leaned closer. "We goin' or what?" he asked under his breath, wary. The leader didn't answer. Instead, he swung his leg over the motorcycle and stood. He rolled his shoulders, stretching out the stiffness in his muscles. Then, slowly, he began walking back toward the cafe. The gang hesitated only for a moment before following. Inside the cafe, Chuck had already noticed. He didn't need to turn his head to know that trouble had found its way back to him. He could hear the heavy bootfalls approaching, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as the locals tensed. He set his cup down on the saucer, exhaling slowly. The bell above the cafe door jingled sharply as it was pushed open. The leader stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a dark storm rolling over the desert. Behind him, his men filtered in, spreading out, forming an unspoken barrier between Chuck and the exit. The waitress instinctively took a step back behind the counter. The trucker in the plaid shirt barely moved, but his fingers twitched against his cup. Chuck didn't move. He simply lifted his gaze, meeting the leader's eyes with the same calm, measured look he had given before. The leader smirked, as if trying to regain some of his lost confidence. "You're real quiet, cowboy," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "I don't like that." Chuck didn't reply. The leader took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor. "See, I don't much care for guys who think they're better than me," he continued, "especially not ones who make me look bad in front of my boys." One of the bikers, a stocky man with tattooed arms, chuckled under his breath. Another cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the silence. Chuck remained motionless. His breathing was steady, his muscles loose, relaxed. The leader exhaled sharply. He reached across the table, grabbing Chuck's coffee cup and lifting it in one hand. "You like coffee, huh?" he muttered. Then, without warning, he threw it to the floor, the ceramic shattering against the wooden boards. The dark liquid spread in a slow, uneven puddle between them. The room was silent. Chuck let out a quiet breath, barely audible, as if taken in the moment. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to be noticeable. Then, before anyone could react, he moved. It happened in an instant. One moment, the leader was standing over him, smug and sure of himself, and the next, Chuck had risen from his seat with the kind of speed that defied logic. His fist struck hard, fast, and precise, driving straight into the leader's gut with enough force to knock the breath clean from his lungs. The man staggered back, his boots scraping against the floor, his entire body folding inward as he gasped for air. The gang erupted into motion. The first one to charge was the stocky biker, his arms swinging in a wide arc, aiming to grab Chuck by the shoulders. But Chuck was already moving, sidestepping with fluid precision. His elbow shot forward, catching the man in the ribs. The biker let out a strangled grunt, stumbling sideways into a table, knocking over a half-eaten plate of food. The second man lunged, throwing a wild punch aimed at Chuck's face. Chuck ducked, his movement effortless, then countered with a sharp, controlled strike to the jaw. The biker reeled back, crashing into one of the booths. The cafe was a flurry of chaos now, tables overturning, chairs scraping against the floor. The leader, still wheezing, straightened up, rage flickering in his eyes. He reached for something at his waist, but before he could draw it, Chuck was on him again. A sharp kick to the knee sent him sprawling. He barely had time to react before Chuck grabbed the front of his jacket, pulling him forward just enough to deliver a solid, unyielding punch straight to the chest. The leader hit the floor hard, his body going limp for a moment. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence now fully shaken. They had come in expecting an easy revenge, a show of dominance, but they had underestimated him badly. Chuck exhaled, adjusting his hat slightly as he straightened. One of the bikers, younger than the rest, took a cautious step back. His fingers twitched near the handle of a pocket knife clipped to his belt, but he hesitated, knowing full well that drawing it would only make things worse. The leader groaned from the ground, rolling onto his side, coughing. Chuck watched him for a moment, then slowly turned his gaze toward the rest of the gang. One by one, they looked at each other. None of them wanted to be the next to step forward. And in that silence, that heavy, undeniable silence, the truth settled in. They had lost. The waitress, still clutching her towel, exhaled shakily. The trucker muttered something under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Chuck turned away from the leader, stepping past the wreckage of overturned tables and spilled coffee. He moved towards the door, his stride unhurried, the same way he had entered. He paused just before stepping outside, his voice quiet even, carrying no anger, no malice. "You should have walked away." Then he left. Behind him, the cafe remained still. Grum stood waiting, patient as ever, and the town, once more, held its breath. The leader of the gang lay sprawled on the cafe floor, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The room was thick with silence, the only sound the faint creak of the wooden beams above and the distant hum of the town that had momentarily paused to witness what had just transpired. His men stood frozen, shifting their weight uncertainly, their earlier bravado stripped away. None of them had expected this. None of them had even come close to seeing it coming. Chuck Norris stood at the threshold of the cafe, his back to them, his hands relaxed at his sides. There was no tension in his stance, no indication that he considered any of them a threat anymore. He had already walked away, and in doing so had made the unspoken truth clear. It was over. But the leader wasn't the kind of man who could accept that. Not yet. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself up onto his elbows. His ribs ached from the blows. His pride burned hotter than any pain in his body. His men were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't let some quiet, nameless cowboy tear him down in front of everyone. His breath came fast, ragged, but his anger drowned out everything else. He reached down, feeling the weight of the blade tucked against his belt. His fingers curled around the handle, slow, deliberate. No one else moved. The tension in the air was suffocating, the weight of unspoken decisions pressing down on the room. Chuck had reached Grom, running a steady hand along the horse's neck, his movements calm, unbothered. But he heard the shift in the air, the nearly imperceptible scrape of metal against leather as the leader of the gang pulled the knife from its sheath. He didn't turn, didn't react, not yet. The waitress let out a sharp, involuntary breath inside the cafe. The trucker stiffened, his hands tightening around his cup. One of the younger bikers opened his mouth to say something, but stopped himself. The leader pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. The knife glinted in the dim light as he held it low, his knuckles white around the handle. His breath was uneven, his pupils blown wide, but there was something in his stance that had changed. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was desperate. Chuck sighed. The leader took a step forward. The silence outside the cafe was deafening. Then he lunged. Chuck turned just in time to catch the movement. The knife arced upward in a wild, uncoordinated swing, aiming for his side. But Chuck was already moving. His hand shot out, catching the leader's wrist mid-strike. The impact of the sudden stop sent a sharp jolt up the man's arm, his fingers twitching, the knife trembling in his grip. Chuck's grip tightened like steel, twisting just enough to force the blade downward without letting it go. For a second, they stood locked, the leader's breath coming out in short, uneven bursts as he struggled against the hold. Chuck's expression didn't change. Then, with a single sharp motion, Chuck twisted the man's wrist further, forcing his fingers to release the knife. It clattered to the wooden planks below. Before the leader could react, Chuck took a step forward, using his opponent's own momentum against him. The movement was precise, practiced. Chuck turned his body, shifting his weight just enough to send the leader stumbling forward, completely off balance. He hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs for the second time that day. The knife lay inches away, but he didn't reach for it. He couldn't. His limbs felt weak, his mind spinning. He had never been handled like that before, not in all his years of fighting, of taking what he wanted. His vision blurred slightly as he rolled onto his side, trying to push himself up. Chuck stepped forward and placed his boot lightly against the man's hand, pressing it into the dirt just enough to make sure he didn't try again. The rest of the gang remained frozen. Chuck's voice was quiet, steady, carrying more weight than any shout ever could. That's how it feels to be helpless. The leader's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his breathing shallow. Chuck lifted his boot away from the man's hand, watching as he slowly curled his fingers inward, as if testing to see if he still had control over them. The reality of the situation settled over the gang like a thick fog. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Some of them glanced toward their bikes. Others looked at each other, trying to figure out what to do next. The leader sat up, his arms resting on his knees, his head tilted downward as if trying to process everything at once. He didn't look at Chuck. He didn't dare. Chuck stepped back, giving the man room, but there was no need for another fight. The lesson had been learned. One of the bikers cleared his throat, hesitated, then took a slow step toward his motorcycle. When Chuck didn't move, didn't stop him, the others began to follow. One by one, they mounted their bikes, their engines rumbling softly in the otherwise silent town. The leader remained on the ground for a few more moments before finally pushing himself up to his feet. He stood there, shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling with every strained breath. His pride had taken more damage than his body. He glanced toward his gang, then toward Chuck, then back down at the knife still lying in the dirt. For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Some last trace of defiance, some last bit of himself that didn't want to let go. Then he exhaled sharply and turned away. He didn't bother picking up the knife. Without another word, he walked toward his bike, climbing onto the seat with slow, measured movements. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The rest of the gang followed suit, revving their engines, their faces drawn and quiet. There was no more laughter, no more jeering, just the low hum of motorcycles and the unspoken understanding that they had lost more than just a fight today. Chuck stood still as they rode off, watching as their figures grew smaller, swallowed by the dust of the open road. When the last of the engines had faded, the silence returned. The town exhaled as one, the tension dissipating like morning mist under the sun. The waitress let out a shaky breath, finally setting down the towel she had been gripping so tightly. The trucker muttered something under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Chuck turned back to Grom, running a hand over the stallion's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The horse flicked his ears, unconcerned, as if knowing all along how this would end. Chuck exhaled, adjusting the brim of his hat. The town was quiet once more, but this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of before. It was something lighter, something settled. The trouble had passed, and no one doubted that it wouldn't return any time soon. The dust from the departing motorcycles lingered in the air like the last breath of a storm that had passed without warning. The town exhaled in silence, its people standing still, absorbing what they had just witnessed. No one spoke, not immediately. It was as if they were waiting for something more, for one final act to close the scene. But there was nothing left to say. The bikers were gone. The threat had been neutralized. Chuck Norris stood beside his horse, his hand resting on Grom's strong neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The stallion flicked his ears, then lowered his head to graze, unconcerned with what had transpired. Chuck exhaled, the tension in his shoulders dissipating, though his posture remained the same. Calm, unwavering, like a man who had done what needed to be done and thought no more of it. The wooden door of the cafe creaked softly as it swung open behind him. The waitress, still clutching the towel she had been gripping for dear life, stepped out onto the porch, her wide eyes fixed on Chuck. She hesitated for a moment before finally speaking, her voice careful, as if afraid to break the quiet. "Well," she said, exhaling sharply, "that was something." Chuck didn't respond immediately. He adjusted the brim of his hat and turned back toward the cafe, his boots crunching against the dirt. He stepped up onto the wooden planks, pausing just outside the door. "They won't be back," he said simply. The waitress let out a short, breathy laugh, not quite sure if it was disbelief or relief. "No," she agreed. "I don't think they will." Inside, the trucker in the plaid shirt was still seated at his booth, his fingers drumming absently against his coffee cup. He shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath. "I've seen a lot of fights in my time," he said finally, looking up, "but I ain't never seen anything like that." Chuck didn't reply. He stepped back inside, the floor creaking beneath his weight. The cafe was a mess. Overturned chairs, a broken table, the shattered remains of his coffee cup still darkening the floor. It was the only sign that something had happened at all. The waitress followed him in, glancing around at the damage. She sighed, tossing the towel over her shoulder. "Guess I've got some cleaning up to do," she muttered. Chuck reached into his pocket and pulled out a few folded bills, setting them down on the counter. She stared at them, then at him, then shook her head. "I ain't taking your money," she said firmly, "not after what you just did for this town." Chuck held her gaze for a moment before nodding once. He slid the money back into his pocket and turned toward the door again. The trucker took a slow sip of his coffee, watching him. "You're just gonna leave, huh?" Chuck adjusted his hat, stepping out onto the porch. "Wasn't planning on staying." The waitress crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "You got a name, cowboy?" Chuck paused for just a fraction of a second, then glanced back at her. There was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his lips. "Yeah," he said, "but I don't think you need it." And with that, he stepped back outside, walking toward his horse. The sun had started its slow descent, stretching long shadows across the ground. The town had begun to move again. People emerged from their shops, their homes, casting glances down the road where the bikers had disappeared. Some whispered to each other, others just watched. An elderly man, the owner of the general store, stepped out onto the porch and tipped his hat toward Chuck as he passed. A young boy, no older than 10, peeked out from behind his mother's skirt, staring up at him with wide, admiring eyes. Chuck reached Grom and untied the reins. The stallion lifted his head, sniffing the air before flicking his tail. Chuck ran a hand down his neck one last time before stepping into the stirrup and swinging himself into the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. The trucker leaned against the doorway of the cafe, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. The waitress folded her arms, watching as Chuck adjusted his seat, settling into the saddle. "You think we'll ever see him again?" she asked. The trucker shrugged. "Men like that, they don't stay in one place for long." Chuck nudged Grom forward, the horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they moved toward the road. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The town had already returned to what it had been before. The people, the buildings, the quiet hum of life moving forward, but there was something different now, something unspoken. The bikers had come looking for trouble, and they had found it, but they hadn't been the ones to decide how things ended. The road stretched out before Chuck, endless and open, disappearing into the horizon. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of the desert, the warmth of the setting sun. He didn't know where he was going next. Didn't need to. The road would take him where he needed to be. And somewhere, in another town, trouble was waiting. But trouble had a habit of backing down when it met a man like Chuck Norris. The waitress watched until he was just a silhouette against the sky, then exhaled, shaking her head with a small, knowing smile. The trucker took another sip of his coffee, and the town, now safe, went on as it always had. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel and share this one with friends who would love it.